So we will be considering the motion brought forward by Mr. Ruff as amended by Madam Damoff. So Madam Damoff, you have to speak on your amendment.
I do, Chair, and just with your indulgence, I have additional amendments that I'd like to make. So I'd be prepared to remove the amendment I had Friday and bring forward new ones if the committee would be okay with that, or I can maybe, I guess I need consent from.
If committee is in consent, you can do that. Otherwise, we'll call the vote on that one, and then if that vote got defeated, so or vote get passed, then you can remove that, and you're welcome to bring back any amendments. So, is it the consensus? Is it committee in agreement that Madam Damoff can take her amendment back and introduce the new one? Okay, so seems like Madam Damoff,
Okay.
everyone is in agreement. So please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. And I'll just preface it by saying that I've had conversations with officials on our side, government officials, who are on nobody's side, actually, that's wrong. We've had conversations, and I understand that the information contained in the request that Mr. Ruff made would impact national security and public safety. And so what I'm going to propose is that we amend the motion to send the documents to the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, which would be the place where documents like that should be reviewed if there's a national security concern, with the condition that government officials provide to our committee by Monday confirmation as to the nature of the documents and their impact on national security and public safety. And then I would remove the last words from the motion to the Afghanistan Committee for inclusion in the report due back in the House by June 8th, 2022. I'll get Charmaine from my office just to send that to the clerk so that it can be distributed. But in essence, the change is leaving Mr. Ruff's motion identical up to the word Special Committee on Afghanistan would be removed. And it would be replaced by, I'll just read the whole thing, Chair, that the Privy Council Office, Global Affairs Canada, and the Canadian Armed Forces, and any other government department provide the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, subject to confirmation by government officials as to the nature of the documents and their impact on national security and public safety by Monday, May 30th, 2022, the already completed or draft after action / review reports with respect to the evacuation of Kabul in August of 2021 from their respective departments.
Okay, thank you. And
thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And now we'll proceed to the debate.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président, juste m'assurer que j'ai.
And point of order, I believe that the interpreters do not have the motions at their disposal. I would like to hear the motion as is because this is quite serious. So I would like to hear the motion as translated. And I think it's important to give us a little break to our friends interpreters who are working very hard.
I'll suspend the meeting for a few minutes. Madam Damoff, could you please send this to clerk so it gets distributed to every member?
We did. Thank you. We did, Chair.
Okay, thank you. And when Madam Clerk gives me go ahead that she have distributed and every member have received it, then we'll proceed. Meeting suspended for a few minutes, please. Discussion and debate on the motion by Mr. Ruff as amended by Madam Demoff. Mr. Chong, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't support Madam Demoff's amendment. NSICOP is not a parliamentary committee. It's not a committee of parliament. In fact, subsection 4.3 of the act that created the committee explicitly states that NSICOP is not a committee of parliament. So we are parliamentarians. We function in parliamentary committees and on the floor of the House of Commons as a whole. And I think giving these documents to an extra parliamentary committee is completely unacceptable. I think Parliament needs information to do its work. And committees and the House as a whole are where we do our work. And that work's on the public record. It's enhanced, it's on video recordings, it's kept in the archives for posterity. This is the place where these documents need to be sent, not to some committee outside of Parliament that sits within the executive branch of government. If we had a committee like the United Kingdom's Intelligence and Security Committee, which in fact is a committee of Parliament whose members are voted on by members of the House of Commons and the House of Lords, then that would be a different matter. But the fact is this committee is not a committee of Parliament and it's not accountable to Parliament. It's accountable to the Prime Minister's office. Its members serve at the pleasure of the Prime Minister. In fact, subsection 5.1 of the act that creates NSICOP makes it clear that all the appointments are GIC at pleasure appointments. In other words, Governor and Council at pleasure appointments of the Prime Minister. And any minister of the government has the right to terminate a committee's review, has the right to deny the committee information, and the Prime Minister has the power to review and demand revisions to reports before they are made public. It's all in the act that creates that committee. And so clearly, it's the wrong place to be sending these documents. In fact, the chair, the committee, just 2 months ago in March, issued a statement of pretty harsh rebuke of the government. In that statement, the committee said that the government had not been giving the committee the information it requested, did not provide relevant material, and that if this continues, the committee's ability to fulfill its statutory mandate will be compromised. This was just 2 months ago. This was publicly reported on. This was a public statement by the committee. This follows on previous concerns that had been raised. Similar concerns have been raised by the committee in 2019 and 2020. So I don't support this amendment. We are parliamentarians. Parliament needs to be respected. The information ought to be sent to a parliamentary committee, not to some committee of the executive branch of government. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So next, thank you, Honorable Chong. And next speaker is Mr. Raff. Mr. Raff, please go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. No, I can't support this amendment either. Look, I can't speak to how PCO or Global Affairs Canada necessarily writes these reviews or reports, but having been part of the pen of many of them in the past from the Canadian Armed Forces, and I'm sure most departments follow a very similar procedure. Every document that is produced on something like this for an actual operation, each paragraph is actually classified based on the content of that paragraph or that report. So like anything that comes out and that gets released into a non-secure committee, it will be redacted. I expect to see redactions in it if it does compromise potential national security. So these reports do need to come to this committee. This is part of our mandate when the motion that created the Special Committee on Afghanistan was to look in and look back at what went wrong, what went right, how can we learn from it to make sure we don't make these mistakes going into the future, as well as the second point and part of the committee is definitely to make sure we're making those necessary changes we need to do from a humanitarian assistance perspective as a primary focus. So these reviews have been done by the government officials, by the departments. Anything that's of national security and needs to be redacted, redact it, in my viewpoint. I'm expecting that's what the way they'd send it to us in the first place, but we need to, the majority of the report should not be redacted. There's most of the stuff that is done is not of a national security brand, and you can just look at the recently released UK report that was publicly released yesterday that was very damning of their response to the evacuation of Kabul and the fall of Afghanistan. And most of the stuff in there that's commented on and that I think a lot of the testimony already alludes to that we've heard over the last number of months, we will find likely very similar conclusions based on what we've heard to date and that may be contained in these reports. So I can't support this amendment from MP Damoff, and hopefully I got Pam's name right this time. Thanks.
Thanks, Mr. Raff. I'll go to Madam Kwan and then to Madam Damoff.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I just want to get some clarity. If the issue is about national security, to which Madam Damoff's amendment suggests that we seek government official to confirm that national security could be put in jeopardy if this was provided to us. If in fact that is confirmed and that is the case, then NCCOP would be the appropriate place, I think, to send this to, because that committee was established to deal with such matters. And it is my understanding, and perhaps the clerk can confirm, that we have a member of parliament from each party represented at this committee. Is that not the case? If that's the case, then in which case, I guess we have to have some faith with our colleagues on that committee to do is due diligence and the work there. If the issue is not around national security, and that was not confirmed by the officials, then there's a real question about it being sent to NCCOP. Then I would think that that's not the appropriate thing to do, and that we should have the document sent to this committee and for it to have gone through the regular process of redaction. Although I note that in the original motion, there is no call for redaction of any sort. There is none of the language that normally shows up on cabinet confidentiality, on national security issues, privacy, redactions that should be vetted by the law clerk. And so that original motion does not provide for that either. So I guess, and given that the amendment is saying that it would be subject to confirmation that national security is at issue, I think that is an important piece. If that confirmation does not come about on Monday, then it puts this issue in a different place, and we should have a further discussion about it.
Mr. Chair, you're on mute.
Thank you, Madam Kwan, and Madam Demoff, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. And I just wanted to clarify that I was on the Public Safety Committee when NCCOP was formed, and the reason that we created this committee was specifically to deal with documents exactly like this. And Ms. Kwan is absolutely correct that there is party representation from all parties currently. I know the Conservative Party doesn't always like this committee and did withdraw their members at one point, but it's my understanding that they do have members on it presently. The committee does report to or provide reports to the Public Safety Committee annually, so I would invite Mr. Chong or Mr. Ruff to attend when the chair of the committee, Mr. McGinty, attends if they have questions that they'd like to ask him. But this committee was created specifically so that we could have a committee deal with issues and documents that are not, that would, that cause a national security concern. And that's why they undergo special swearing in, they're sworn to secrecy, they have a number of security measures in place for the members and the committee itself and the people who work for the committee. So it's very different. And I think it's important to recognize that this isn't sloughing it off, that NCCOP is there for a valid reason. This is the right place. And as Ms. Kwan said, if we don't get confirmation from government officials by Monday that there are national security concerns, then this is a moot point, but I've been assured that we will. So I think we need to take government officials at their word as well. So I'll leave it at that because I don't think we need to belabor this too long.
Okay, thank you, Madam Demoff. Mr. Baker, please go ahead, and then Mr. Ruff.
Thanks very much, Chair. I just wanted to weigh in on this. I mean, I think that it's really important, and listening to Mr. Chong speak, he spoke to the fact that parliamentarians need information to do their work, and I think that I agree with that. But I also agree that we all have an obligation to jointly work to protect national security, and the NCCOP committee is designed to allow parliamentarians, our colleagues who are MPs and parliamentarians, to get access to information to do that work while also protecting national security. And I think that that's the balance that I think Ms. Demoff is trying to strike. So I think that it's only fair when we're asking for documents from national defense and others around military operations and that sort of stuff that we consider the national security implications. There is one, and so why not put our faith, as Ms. Kwan said, why not put our faith in our colleagues in on the NSCOP committee to review those documents. That way the information, MPs or parliamentarians have access to that information, but we also don't put national security at risk. So I support what Ms. DeMoff has put forward.
Thank you, Mr. Baker, Mr. Raff, and then Mr. Alkhoury. Mr. Raff, go ahead, please. Floor is yours.
Thanks, Chair. Look, I just want to go back to what I said earlier. Redaction will occur automatically on these reports of anything that gets released to this. So any information that is of national security concern will be protected. They're not going to release, none of the departments will release to this committee anything that's of a national security. They're mandated not to. So in the end, they will release the redacted reports, as I stated earlier, being somebody with a top secret security clearance, having been on the national security file as a Canadian Armed Forces member for over 25 years, and I'm not taking away from anybody else on this committee. We have former privy councillors on this committee as well, people that understand these issues very, very, very well. My point is, those redactions will occur, but we need those reports, we need those dates, because again, that's what we've been mandated to do, to understand what was the process, how it happened, what aspects maybe are of national security concerns. And again, those will be redacted. Personally, I have no issues if we want to add an addition to the motion that says, and we send any of the reports that are or the complete reports, including any national security concerns, or that are redacted, to another committee to look at. There's other tools we can look at, from swearing people in to review it as well. So it's actually being done by a committee of parliament and not a committee of parliamentarians. But look, I just want to make sure it's crystal clear. Nobody protects and understands and will defend national security more than myself. However, as I stated, these reports, at least the ones that the way they are written by the Canadian Armed Forces, are broken down, that each paragraph will be either unclassified, confidential, secret, or etc. When that's how the reports are written when it comes to these after action reviews that are done after an operation or post-op report. So I'll leave my comments at that for now.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Raff. We'll go to Mr. Alkhoury and then Honorable Chong. Mr. Alkhoury is gone away.
Thank you, Chair. No, thank you, Chair. I think we have heard almost all opinion about this matter, and I agree with Mrs. Kwan, what she said. If we have promised that we receive those documents by Monday, or we have to trust this committee, I believe it's time to go to a vote, and in order not to delay it and to gain time and to go to other issue to go further in our meeting of today. I suggest to go to a vote, Mr. Chair.
You're on mute, Mr. Chair.
Sorry. Thank you, Mr. Alkhoury. I can't go to the vote, as long as I see the hand raised. I see Honorable Chong has his hand raised, so I'll go to Mr. Chong. Floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't want to delay a vote on this either, but this is a really important issue, and it's a long-standing problem in our Canadian Parliament. Look, I feel passionately about this, and I feel strongly about this, and this is an issue that has transcended partisan politics. It is an issue that has bedeviled our Parliament for decades now. And through both liberal and conservative governments, it's a problem. We do not have the information necessary to do our jobs. And this is a longstanding issue that precedes the current government, an issue that we are witnessing again on this committee. And I believe strongly that one of the reasons why this country lags in national security issues is precisely because of a lack of parliamentary oversight. We do not have a committee of parliament. We do not have parliamentary committees that are empowered to have access to highly classified documents of the highest order that will ensure that there is a watchdog over the government's national security and intelligence activities, whether they relate to what happened in Afghanistan or they relate to other matters of national security. And I think that's the reason why we continue to see problems with national security in our country, problems with the government doing better on national security. And until we as parliamentarians ourselves assert ourselves and hold the government accountable for giving us information, we are going to continue to see a decline in these institutions, these national security institutions. And these have consequences. You know, we are not part of the AUKUS agreement that was recently announced. It took everybody by surprise. We weren't even aware that it was coming down the pipe last fall when it was announced. You know, we are an outlier in not having access to these documents. You know, the UK, as I mentioned, has a committee of parliament that has access to highly classified information. It's the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament. Its members are not appointed by the Prime Minister. They are elected by the two chambers in their parliament. Their chair is elected as well. And they have access to documents of the most classified nature. In the US Congress, they have both in the upper chamber, the Senate, and then their House of Representatives, committees that have access to highly classified documents. And as a result, I think their respective governments do a much better job in protecting the national security of their populations relative to our country. And that's not a partisan comment, because this problem has predated the appointment of this government in November of 2015. And so, you know, I encourage everybody on this committee to vote down this amendment, because we have to start to assert ourselves. And we are not going to get these documents either here or elsewhere unless we as parliamentarians start asserting ourselves and saying we have the right to these documents, as Speaker Milliken confirmed in his precedent-setting ruling some time ago, that we are the grand inquest of the nation, that we have under Section 18 of the Constitution, we have unfettered rights, long-held rights to these documents, whether they're redacted or unredacted. And we've got to start demanding this kind of information so that we can get the job done, so that we can hold the government's feet to the fire, so that they can in turn do a much better job of managing issues, whether it's Afghanistan or other issues. And I'll just finish by saying this, Mr. Chair, quickly. To my knowledge, Parliament has never had a national security breach. I don't recall any document or information that was injurious to national security that was ever leaked by a parliamentary committee or by the House as a whole. But I can list dozens of examples across many different governments of national security breaches that are of the highest order and that are egregious. And you know, we all know about the Winnipeg Lab document issue and Chinese military scientists in the Winnipeg Lab, but it predates that. We had a former employee of that lab under the previous Harper government that tried to smuggle prohibited materials across the Canada-US border from that lab. And he was arrested by US border officials back, I think, in 2008, 2009. I think of the Canada Revenue Agency breaches. I think of, you know, just last October, several hundred, the very issue that we're on about now, several hundred vulnerable Afghans that were seeking refuge from the Taliban had their names leaked by a government department. So there's tons of examples of this. We are parliamentarians. We will be respectful with information that's injurious to national security, that could be compromising to national security. And so let's not diminish Parliament by suggesting that somehow we can't handle this information, but the government can, because the facts say otherwise. And I'll just finish with that, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Chong. And we'll go to Madam Demoff, please. One thing, I saw Mr. Ruff's hand was raised before Madam Finley, but he lowered and then he raised again. Okay, that's correct. Okay, thank you. So we'll go to Madam Demoff and then Madam Finley, you will be the next one. So go ahead, Madam Demoff.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just wondering if we could suspend for 10 minutes, Chair, just to have a chance to discuss amongst my colleagues, perhaps come up with another solution. So could we just suspend for 10 minutes?
Okay, I see. Okay, yeah. Okay, I will suspend the meeting for a few minutes.
Thank you, Chair. question about whether there's national security involved here, and we have a commitment to get a letter by Monday. So Chair, I'm going to move that we adjourn debate. And well, I'm just going to move that we adjourn debate and we resume this on Monday.
Okay. Thank you. So I have the, Madam Clerk, can you call the vote on this?
Sorry, Chair, that's to adjourn the meeting. Sorry, I'm moving that we adjourn the meeting, just to be clear. You're on mute, Chair.
I got that. I adjourn the meeting. I'm sorry, because it's non-debatable, so I'm gonna ask the clerk to take the vote.
On the motion to adjourn the meeting, Mr. Baker.
In favor.
Ms. Demoff.
Yes.
Monsieur Elkhoury.
Pour.
Mr. Sidhu.
Yes.
Ms. Zaid.
Yes.
Mr. Chong.
I vote against the motion.
Ms. Findlay.
I vote against.
Mr. Halan.
Against.
Mr. Ruff.
Against.
Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe.
Pour.
Ms. Kwan.
For.
Fours, 7. Against, 4.
Meeting adjourned. Thank you. And